The smell of burning cedar still clung to my hair the morning she swaggered into my courtroom. Lorna Gates, Whitmore, Silver Tesla, spray tan perfection, and the HOA president of Silver Ridge Heights had just turned my house into a pile of ashes. And now she was standing 10 feet from the federal judge she'd tried to err. She didn't know I'd spent 20 years dismantling liars, con artists, and worse, all with the stroke of a gavel. She thought torching my home would silence me. Instead, it gave me a front row seat to her own legal execution. Because when you burn down a judge's house, you're not starting a war. You're starting your sentencing hearing. And I was about to make sure hers came with extra years, stacked like firewood. The scent of cedar smoke was still tangled in my hair the morning she strutted into my courtroom like she owned the place. Lorna Gates, Whitmore, 45 years old, dripping with the kind of self-importance you could smell before she even opened her mouth, had just burned my home to the ground. And now, she was 10 feet away from me, smiling like she'd just closed a real estate deal. I'd spent 2 decades as a federal judge dismantling liars, con artists, and people who thought rules were optional. She thought torching my house would scare me into silence. Oh, no. All she'd done was hand me a loaded gavel and beg me to use it. But to understand why that morning was the beginning of her downfall, you need to rewind 6 months, back to when Silver Ridge Heights still looked like the place Daniel and I had chosen to spend the rest of our lives. My name is Judge Caroline Mercer, born in Durango, Colorado, daughter of a ranch foreman and a school librarian. I worked my way through law school waiting tables and editing legal textbooks, then spent 20 years in courtrooms where the air always smelled faintly of polished oak and tension. My black robes have seen murder trials, corporate fraud cases, and just about every shade of human arrogance you can imagine. And then came the worst case of my life, Daniel's cancer. Daniel and I were married 27 years. He was my anchor. The man who could quote Shakespeare and fix a leaking faucet in the same afternoon. Losing him felt like someone had hollowed me out with a dull knife and left me walking around with nothing but echoes inside. After he died, our 1930s mountain lodge in Silver Ridge Heights became both my sanctuary and my prison. That house wasn't just wood and stone. It was Daniel's laugh caught in the rafters, the smell of his cedar shaving soap in the bathroom cabinet, the rose garden he'd planted the year we moved in. Those roses, blood red, deep as a fine Cabernet, were so vivid in the morning light they almost looked unreal. I swear the garden bloomed harder that first spring without him, like the flowers were trying to fill the silence. Silver Ridge Heights used to be the kind of place where neighbors borrowed tools instead of filing complaints. Teachers, firefighters, retirees who'd lived there for decades. Summer afternoons were for repairing fences, not hiring landscapers to roll out turf like it was a red carpet. But that was before the neighborhood revitalization crowd arrived. Revitalization, in their dictionary, meant bulldozing modest homes and building sprawling status symbols, 3-car garages, home gyms, wine cellars nobody needed. Property taxes shot up like bottle rockets, and longtime residents sold under pressure. The ones who stayed were treated like outdated furniture. And in that power shift, the queen bee emerged, Lorna Gates Whitmore. Picture this platinum blonde hair so lacquered you could use it as a helmet, a spray tan so orange it could guide lost hikers home, athleisure outfits worth more than some people's monthly income, and a silver Tesla she always parked diagonally to avoid dings. She carried a $22 acai smoothie in one hand, her phone in the other, ready to lecture anyone within range about community standards. Lorna and her husband, a contractor with the business ethics of a raccoon in a jewelry store, moved in 2 years earlier. By the time their boxes were unpacked, she had crowned herself HOA president. Her mission, announced at her first meeting, was to elevate Silver Ridge to its highest potential. Translation, turn it into her own curated kingdom and drive out anyone who didn't fit her glossy vision board. My first encounter with her happened on a crisp October morning. The kind where the air smells like pine needles and wood smoke. I was in the front yard, sleeves rolled up, installing the privacy fence Daniel and I had planned together in his final months, 6 feet of warm cedar boards. Our last project. He'd wanted it to shield us from prying eyes while we drank coffee in our pajamas and watched the sun crawl over the ridgeline. The roses were still blooming, their scent threading through the cool air, making my throat tighten. That's when I heard the crunch of expensive boots on dry leaves. "You must be the widow," she said, skipping right over introductions or condolences. "Judge Mercer," I corrected, brushing soil from my hands. "Right, the judge." She said it like she was diagnosing me with something incurable. "I'm Lorna Gates Whitmore, HOA president. We have a problem." Out came a pink tape measure, snapped open with all the drama of a courtroom objection. She stretched it across the fence like she was checking the length of a crime scene. 6 foot 2 inches, she declared. "Our regulations clearly state a 6-foot maximum. That's a $500 violation plus immediate removal." I took my time standing, joints stiff from nights of restless sleep. "Show me that regulation," I said evenly. Her manicured nails tapped through a leather binder, the sound sharp as gavel strikes. 5 minutes of flipping later, she had nothing. The rule didn't exist. My fence was exactly 6 feet. I'd hired a licensed surveyor to make sure of it. A blotchy flush crept under her spray tan. "We'll see about that. Judge." It wasn't just the words. It was the acid she laced them with. That evening, I sat at the kitchen table, Daniel's favorite bourbon untouched beside me, and dug into public court records. It didn't take long. 3 years ago, Whitmore Custom Builders, her husband's company, had stood in my courtroom, accused of trying to swindle an 82-year-old veteran out of $40,000 for emergency roof repairs. The roof had been perfectly fine. I'd ruled against them, referred the case for criminal investigation, and slapped them with fines hefty enough to rattle their bank accounts for years. Now here she was, taking aim at my fence. This wasn't about community aesthetics. This was personal. But Lorna had just made a fatal miscalculation. She'd picked a fight with someone who'd spent 20 years sentencing murderers, con artists, and fraudsters without flinching. Someone who understood every inch of the legal battlefield and had absolutely nothing left to lose. She thought she was starting a petty neighborhood squabble. What she'd actually done was sign up for a war she could never win. By the way, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? And what time is it right now? Because the revenge I'm about to walk you through gets brutal. If I'd learned anything from years on the bench, it's that bullies never open with their knockout punch. They probe. They test. They start small, like a pickpocket brushing past you to see if you'll notice before going for the wallet. And Lorna Gates Whitmore, she was about to test me like she'd made it her full-time occupation. The first strike landed 3 weeks after our fence incident. I heard the mailman's hesitant knock before I saw the envelope. Thick, cream-colored stationery, gold-embossed HOA logo, like it was the seal of the Supreme Court. The man wouldn't even meet my eyes as he held it out. "Certified letter," he muttered, almost apologetically. Inside Violation Notice 1, Unapproved Decorative Garden Feature Translation, Daniel's Memorial Stone. A simple, polished granite marker carved with "In memory of love that grows eternal." It sat nestled between his roses, where his ashes lay, catching morning light the way he used to catch my gaze over coffee. According to Lorna, it disrupted the uniform landscape aesthetic of Silver Ridge Heights. My hands didn't shake from fear, they shook from rage. This wasn't about aesthetics. This was about taking a hammer to the last place my husband still existed in the world. 3 days later, another envelope. Violation Notice 2, Non-Regulation Mailbox Color. My black steel mailbox had stood in the same spot since 1985, back when Reagan was president, and half the neighborhood still had rotary phones. Now, suddenly, it clashed with the neighborhood palette. The kicker, the HOA website still showed black as the standard. I ignored them both, which, in hindsight, was like bleeding in shark-infested waters. On day 7, Violation Notice 3, Excessive bird feeding, creating nuisance conditions. I owned one modest bird feeder. It hung outside my kitchen window and attracted cardinals, Daniel's favorite, whose red feathers lit up the morning like sparks. Watching them had become my ritual, coffee in hand, steam curling into the crisp air, pretending for a moment that Daniel might walk in and set his mug beside mine. Now, according to Lorna, that feeder was a threat to community tranquility. The fines ranged from $100 to $500 each, with threats of liens and escalated legal action. The stationery alone probably cost more than some of the fines. Here's where my years as a judge paid off. Back in law school, I'd memorized Colorado's HOA statutes after a particularly slimy landlord tried to strong-arm me with bogus citations. The rules were clear. Fines must be reasonable. They must be based on actual violations written in the bylaws. They require proper notice and a hearing before enforcement. Lorna's letters failed all three. They cited regulations that didn't exist, skipped hearings entirely, and were so sloppily worded a first-year law student could have shredded them for sport. So, I started doing what I do best, building a case. Nights found me in Daniel's old study, surrounded by the scent of aged pine shelves and the comforting must of old law books. The desk lamp cast a warm circle of light over neat stacks of paper as I drafted formal complaints to the Colorado Real Estate Commission. I took photos of every inch of my property from multiple angles. I printed and dated each letter she'd sent. I even built a color-coded spreadsheet documenting the timeline, violation type, and applicable bylaw section or lack thereof. But Lorna wasn't satisfied with just paper threats. It was a Thursday morning when my phone pinged with a live feed from my newly installed security cameras. I was downtown sentencing a drunk driver to 18 months in county jail. On my screen, Lorna, sauntering into my backyard like she'd bought the deed, flanked by her usual entourage. To her left, a skeletal woman dressed entirely in white, the kind of person who looked like she'd faint if confronted with actual manual labor. On her right, a man built like a fitness magazine cover, clipboard in hand, clearly more familiar with bicep curls than property statutes. For nearly 2 hours, they staged their own little inspection drama. The designer pointed at Daniel's roses with a look of pure disdain, as if 15 years of cultivation offended her personal brand. The trainer scribbled on his clipboard like he was drafting new HOA laws on the spot. Watching the footage that evening, I felt my jaw lock so tight it hurt. This wasn't pettiness anymore. This was deliberate fabrication, fraudulent evidence creation. In court, we call that conspiracy to commit fraud. And then came the knock that turned my simmering anger into full boil. It was Walt Henderson. Walt's the kind of neighbor who doesn't just wave from the porch. He leans on the railing and tells you what's really going on. Vietnam vet. Smokes a pipe that smells like leather and maple syrup. Been in Silver Ridge since before the pavement on our streets had fully set. Judge, he said, voice low, you're not the only one she's after. He told me about the Rodriguez family. Nice folks. Yard always tidy. Their crime, a small Virgin of Guadalupe statue in their garden. Lorna fined them $800 for non-conforming religious imagery until they sold the house and moved out. Then there was a single mom whose kids drew rainbows and hopscotch squares on their driveway with chalk. Lorna fined her for defacing common area aesthetics. Rain washed it away in 2 days, but the fine stuck. By the time Walt finished, my pen was already scratching notes onto a legal pad. A pattern was forming. Lorna wasn't enforcing rules, she was weaponizing them. Her targets anyone who didn't fit her glossy brochure vision of Silver Ridge Heights minority families, single mothers, elderly residents on fixed incomes. And now, she'd decided to aim that machine squarely at me, a federal judge who had, not so coincidentally, shredded her husband's contracting business in court years earlier. She thought she was playing neighborhood politics. She had no idea she'd just wandered onto a battlefield I'd spent 20 years mastering. The petty phase was over. The war had begun. The thing about HOA bullies like Lorna Gates Whitmore is they don't know when to stop. They mistake your silence for surrender, not realizing you're just letting them dig the hole deep enough to bury themselves in. And Lorna. She was swinging that shovel like she was training for the HOA Olympics. After Walt's visit, I doubled down on my security setup. Every corner of my property had coverage. Now motion sensors, high-definition cameras, even discrete audio pickups hidden under the eaves. Daniel used to tease me about over-preparing, but I could hear his voice in my head now. If you can prove it, you can win it. It didn't take long for the cameras to pay off. One Tuesday morning, while I was downtown delivering a sentencing for a meth lab operator, my phone buzzed. Motion alert backyard. I swiped the screen and there she was again. Lorna dressed in head-to-toe Lululemon, like she was about to run a half marathon through my property. The same skeletal designer trailed behind her, carrying a leather portfolio. The clipboard-clutching trainer followed, eyes scanning like a cheap security guard. This time, they didn't just look. They started moving things. The designer tilted my bird feeder at an odd angle, took photos, and scribbled something down. The trainer tugged at the latch on my back gate, testing it. Lorna stood in the middle of my garden, arms crossed, smirking into the camera like she knew it was there and wanted me to see her. The gall of it made my teeth ache. When I pulled the footage later, I noticed something worse. They weren't just snooping. They were staging evidence. A potted plant was shoved into the middle of the walkway. A small stack of firewood was dragged up against the side of the house. I knew the tactic. I'd seen it in fraud cases before. Manufacture violations, then fine the owner into submission. But the thing about manufactured evidence is, it's still evidence. And now, it was mine. That evening, I started making calls. Not to the HOA, I was done playing that game, but to people who knew how to deal with predators like Lorna. First was Pat Donnelly, a woman the neighborhood knew as the kindly retiree with the best vegetable garden in Silver Ridge. What they didn't know, Pat had spent 25 years as a senior investigator for the FBI's Financial Crimes Division. She showed up at my house with oatmeal cookies and a manila folder thick enough to choke a paper shredder. "Judge," she said, easing herself into Daniel's old armchair, "I think we're looking at something bigger than just you." Pat slid photos across the table. Meet Linda Grant. Phoenix, Arizona. 2 years ago, she was Beth Whitmore in Sacramento. 3 years before that, she was Sandra Hall in Detroit. Every photo was Lorna, different hair, different wardrobe, same calculating eyes. According to Pat, each identity came with the same pattern: move into an established community. Seize HOA control. Target select residents with harassment until they moved or gave in. Drain HOA emergency funds. Stage accidents or fires for insurance payouts. She's stolen over $3 million in the last decade, Pat said flatly. And she's not working alone. Her husband's companies launder the payouts. I felt my pulse slow the way it does in court when all the pieces fall into place. This wasn't just some entitled HOA president with a grudge. This was an organized criminal operation hiding in plain sight. And she had just picked a fight with the one neighbor in America who could dismantle her legally, piece by piece. We started mapping out our moves that night. Pat would dig through financials and pull property records. Walt would work the neighborhood, gathering stories and witnesses. My role was to start the paperwork, formal complaints to the Colorado Real Estate Commission, evidence logs, and preservation notices. I knew exactly which statutes Lorna was violating, and I wasn't going to waste a single one. But Lorna wasn't slowing down either. Within days, more letters started coming. Each more ridiculous than the last, improperly positioned outdoor lighting because my porch lantern pointed at the walkway instead of enhancing curb symmetry. Unapproved seasonal decor, a simple autumn wreath on my door. Potential hazard from stacked firewood, 3 logs next to the fireplace inside my screened porch. Each fine came with a deadline so short you'd need a time machine to comply. And each one had her signature at the bottom. The loops in her L sharp enough to cut glass. She didn't know it yet, but every envelope was another nail in her legal coffin. The night the last notice arrived, I sat at Daniel's desk with Pat and Walt. Between us, stacks of letters, printed photos, witness statements, and financial documents. The smell of pipe tobacco mixed with the faint scent of roses drifting in from the garden. "This isn't harassment anymore," Pat said. "It's racketeering." I leaned back in my chair, the weight of the moment settling on me. Then it's time we treat it like racketeering. The next move wouldn't just stop Lorna's game. It would end it and her reign over Silver Ridge Heights permanently. When you've spent as many years as I have in a federal courtroom, you learn that the real power isn't in raising your voice. It's in building a case so airtight the other side suffocates before they even step into court. And by this point, with Pat and Walt by my side, that's exactly what we were doing to Lorna Gates Whitmore. The deeper we dug, the uglier it got. Pat's investigative files looked like something out of a mob case. HOA meeting, minutes altered after the fact. Checks written to shell companies with names like Mountain View Maintenance, LLC, that didn't exist beyond a PO box. Emergency repairs billed for tens of thousands when not a single nail had been touched. It wasn't just my fence or Daniel's memorial stone anymore. We had documented proof that in less than 2 years, Lorna had siphoned nearly $180,000 out of the Silver Ridge Emergency Fund, and she'd done it with the precision of someone who'd been running this scam in other states for years. "You've got her dead to rights on embezzlement," Pat said one night, sliding a ledger toward me, "but she's not going to wait for us to file charges. She'll escalate." Walt nodded grimly. "She's already spreading rumors. Said she caught you hiding unpermitted structures and that she's bringing in county inspectors." I almost laughed until I realized the tactic. She wasn't just trying to fine me into submission. She was setting up a paper trail to make it look like I was the problem. And then came the trespass. It was a Thursday morning, and I was in court sentencing a man for aggravated assault. My phone buzzed mid-hearing motion alert. I couldn't check it until lunch, but when I did, I nearly dropped my coffee. Lorna, wearing a coral yoga set and mirrored sunglasses, was in my backyard. She had her pink tape measure in one hand and her phone in the other, snapping photos of my windows, my garden, even my kitchen through the glass. Then she did something that made my blood run cold. She walked to the back gate, yanked it open, and tested the latch to make sure it wouldn't close. Then she left it wide open and walked away with a satisfied smirk. I didn't notice Gavels, my 14-year-old tabby, was missing until I got home that evening. Gavel wasn't just a cat. He was Daniel's final gift to me, rescued from the courthouse parking lot during a thunderstorm. He'd sat on Daniel's lap during chemo, purring comfort into the pain. Losing him would be like losing Daniel all over again. I searched for 3 days straight. Walt organized neighbors into search teams. The Rodriguezes, who'd moved away after Lorna's harassment, drove back from 2 towns over to help. The call came on the 3rd night. "Judge Mercer, this is Dr. Lewis at Pine Valley Animal Emergency. Someone brought in a cat matching your description. He's in rough shape." I found Gavel barely conscious in an oxygen tent, his ribs broken, dehydrated, and too weak to even lift his head. $900 in emergency surgery later, the vet told me his injuries were consistent with being chased by machinery leaf blowers, maybe lawn equipment. That's when I pulled the security footage. 1 hour after Lorna left my gate open, her landscaping crew arrived with industrial leaf blowers. They drove Gavel into the street, chasing him for 2 blocks until he fell into a storm drain. I sat in Daniel's chair, watching that footage, my hands trembling with a cold, surgical kind of rage. This wasn't harassment anymore. This was attempted murder of the last living piece of my husband. The next morning, I filed criminal charges for unlawful entry and animal cruelty, but that was just the start. Pat called one of her old contacts at the Denver field office of the FBI. Walt delivered a thumb drive with the footage to the Colorado Attorney General's office, and I picked up the phone and called Sarah Martinez, Channel 7's investigative bulldog, who loved nothing more than exposing suburban corruption. 3 nights later, Judge versus HOA. When Watchdogs Bite Back aired in living rooms across the state, it showed Lorna trespassing, her crew terrorizing Gavel, and a highlight reel of every family she'd driven out of Silver Ridge. The public reaction was immediate and volcanic. Donations poured in for Gavel's vet bills and my legal fund. 3 law firms offered to take my case pro bono. 5 more families came forward with their own horror stories, all with paperwork, photos, and sworn statements. The Attorney General's office formally opened a civil rights investigation, and the HOA board, the very people who'd rubber-stamped Lorna's every move, started resigning in waves. But Lorna, she doubled down. I'd cut off her petty revenue streams and made her the face of suburban villainy on the evening news. Now she was cornered. And cornered animals, especially the kind that feed on control, don't slink away quietly. They bite. Lorna Gates. Whitmore didn't just bite back, she came at me like a cornered wolf, teeth bared, ready to maul. It started with a certified envelope on my desk, heavy as a brick in my hand. The return address made my pulse hitch Colorado Judicial Discipline Commission. I'd been on the receiving end of plenty of threats in my career, but this was different. This was a knife aimed at my badge, my reputation, my life's work. Inside was a complaint that read like it had been ghostwritten by a conspiracy theorist on a caffeine binge. According to Lorna, I had been abusing judicial authority to intimidate law-abiding homeowners and weaponizing the legal system for personal vendettas. The supporting evidence was almost laughable if it hadn't been so calculated photographs of my property, digitally altered to make Daniel's memorial garden look like a trash heap, and sworn statements from her designer and trainer claiming I'd threatened them with professional ruin. The timestamps on the photos were all wrong. One showed the garden under snow despite being dated in June. The so-called statements read like bad courtroom drama dialogue, but the presentation was slick enough that, to someone skimming, it could pass as legitimate. By lunch, the complaint had mysteriously leaked to a political blog with a long-standing grudge against me for my environmental rulings. By dinner, it had spread to 3 more outlets. The headline made my coffee taste like rust. Liberal judge terrorizes patriotic HOA. From there, it was a feeding frenzy. Talk radio hosts frothed at the mouth about activist judges with vendettas. Online comment sections turned into digital lynch mobs. I was accused of everything from judicial corruption to hating America. One particularly charming poster suggested I should be shipped to Alaska with the other communists. For 72 straight hours, my phone didn't stop ringing. Colleagues calling to check in, reporters circling like vultures, friends texting offers to come over with a bottle of bourbon and a shovel. And underneath it all, the sense that somewhere, just across the manicured lawns of Silver Ridge Heights, Lorna was smiling that smug little smile. She thought she'd found my weak spot, my reputation. She had no idea she'd just given me the final piece of the puzzle. On the 3rd night, I got a knock at my door. Pat Donnelly stepped in carrying a Tupperware of oatmeal cookies in one hand and a stack of manila folders in the other. Most people in Silver Ridge knew her as the sweet retiree with the best tomatoes in town. What they didn't know was that Pat had spent 25 years as a senior investigator for the FBI's Financial Crimes Division. I knew that when she showed up with folders, something big was about to happen. She sat down in Daniel's old armchair like she owned the place. "Judge," she said, her voice calm but with that edge I'd come to recognize. "I think you'll want to see this." She spread out the contents of the folders across my kitchen table. Driver's licenses from 4 different states, insurance claims, court records. The names varied: Linda Grant of Phoenix, Sandra Hall of Detroit, Beth Whitmore of Sacramento. But the face was always the same Lorna's. Different hairstyles, different wardrobes, same calculating eyes. "She's a professional community destroyer," Pat said flatly. 4 states, 6 identities. Always the same pattern: move into an established neighborhood, take over the HOA, target selected residents with harassment until they either sell or break, drain the HOA's emergency funds, then stage an accident or fire for the insurance payout. The numbers were staggering. "She's stolen over $4 million in the last decade," Pat continued, her fingers drumming on the table. "And she's not doing it alone. Her husband's companies launder the payouts. Every LLC they touch is either a ghost company or a pass-through for embezzled money." I studied the insurance records. Her current Silver Ridge Heights policy valued her $900,000 home at $2.8 million. She'd lied about prior claims, used a false name on the application, and had already filed preliminary paperwork for structural issues and safety hazards that didn't exist. Pat leaned in, lowering her voice. "You're the distraction. Well, she's got you tangled in this petty HOA nonsense. She's been draining the association's emergency funds and setting up for the next accidental fire. Your house isn't just a target. Judge, it's scheduled to be evidence in her next scam." I felt my jaw tighten. My case against her had always been personal, but now it was bigger than me, much bigger. And then Pat dropped the bomb. "One more thing, she's technically still in the Federal Witness Protection Program. Testified against a Detroit fraud ring in 2012, served 18 months. Disappeared from the program in 2015. Every identity since then has been stolen." That made my breath catch. The implications were huge. A witness protection violation alone was 10 years in federal prison. Stack that with multi-state fraud, identity theft, embezzlement, civil rights violations, and attempted arson against a federal judge. We weren't talking about the possibility of prison time, we were talking about life without parole. No parole hearings, no second chances. I sat back, letting the weight of it all sink in. My personal war with Lorna was just one front in a much larger battlefield. She'd been running this play for years, leaving behind communities in ashes, sometimes literally, and families financially and emotionally gutted. Pat was still talking, laying out timelines, connecting dots between states, even pointing to contractors Lorna had used before who'd since vanished. "She's arrogant," Pat said finally, "and arrogance is always the crack in the armor. She's too confident you can't touch her because she's been untouchable everywhere else." I looked at the stack of evidence spread across the table: driver's licenses, fake insurance claims, falsified HOA financial statements, and felt that familiar calm settle over me. The same one I get right before I lower the gavel on a guilty verdict. "She's never played against someone like me," I said. And with that, the war stopped being defensive. It was time to dismantle her operation piece by piece, using the one thing she'd never been able to beat: the full, unrelenting weight of the law. When we finally shifted from defense to offense, the change in the air was almost physical. Gone was the reactive scramble to answer her absurd letters and defend my property line. Now we were building something bigger, a legal machine with teeth sharp enough to bite clean through the empire Lorna Gates Whitmore had spent a decade perfecting. We set up what Pat called the war room in my kitchen. Daniel's sturdy oak table, once covered in rose clippings and crossword puzzles, was now buried under stacks of financial records, printed emails, HOA bylaws, and witness statements. The hum of my upgraded security system blended with the quiet rhythm of Pat's methodical sorting. Walt sat at the end of the table with a yellow legal pad, jotting down every name he could think of that might have a Lorna horror story to tell. Rebecca Morgan, a Denver attorney I'd worked with on federal racketeering cases years ago, drove up the mountain with 3 paralegals and a briefcase full of federal templates. Rebecca wasn't the type to chat about the weather. She was the type who could stare down a mob accountant until they offered her their ledgers and a confession just to make her stop looking at them. "Judge," she said, sliding into the seat opposite me, "we're not just going after her for HOA harassment. We're dismantling an interstate fraud ring." Rebecca laid it out like a military operation. Step 1. Freeze the HOA's accounts before she could move the money. Emergency injunctions were drafted before lunch. Step 2. File criminal complaints in 3 jurisdictions simultaneously, 1 for fraud, 1 for civil rights violations, and 1 for racketeering. Step 3. Alert every insurance company with a policy tied to Silver Ridge Heights about pending fraud investigations, triggering mandatory audits. Pat coordinated with her old FBI contacts, and by the next morning, Lorna had more federal eyes on her than some small-time terror cells. Walt worked his network of long-time residents, coaxing statements from people who'd moved away years ago. The Johnsons, who'd been fined into bankruptcy over a wheelchair ramp for their disabled son, were ready to testify. Mrs. Rodriguez had 17 neighbors lined up as witnesses. Meanwhile, my security system was now courtroom-grade evidence collection, 4K video, wide-angle lenses, directional microphones that could catch a whispered insult across the street. Every time Lorna so much as lifted her phone to take a photo of my yard, I got a time-stamped recording. Every email she sent as HOA president was copied to a secure legal archive. "She's committing fresh crimes every day," Pat said one night, reviewing the logs. "Every letter, every bogus violation, it's all new evidence." The beauty of it was that she didn't know we were this far ahead. She still thought I was the same grieving widow she'd cornered at my fence months ago, clinging to my roses and hoping the storm would pass. She didn't realize I'd turned the storm into a Category 5 aimed directly at her. But desperate people get reckless, and Lorna was about to prove it. It started with an anonymous tip to the local fire marshal about dangerous conditions at my home. The timing wasn't subtle. It came less than 48 hours after our injunction froze the HOA's operating account. Fire Marshal Jake Morrison, 30 years on the job, showed up at my door with a clipboard and a polite but skeptical look. We walked my property together. Morrison's trained eyes spotted it immediately. Accelerant residue near my garage. Gas lines tampered with to create leaks. Piles of dry vegetation strategically placed near wiring. Judge, he said quietly, crouching by a trail of chemical-stained dirt. This isn't negligence. This is staged fire prep. Someone setting up your house to burn. I didn't have to guess who. Morrison documented everything, photographed every mark, and collected samples for lab testing. And just when I thought I couldn't be more disgusted, he told me what happened next. She offered me cash, he said, shaking his head, slid an envelope across my clipboard, and suggested we could handle the inspection off the books. That was it, bribery of a public official, a federal felony with a decade-long minimum sentence. And she'd done it on his department-issued body camera. By that evening, Pat's network confirmed similar fire staging at 3 other Silver Ridge properties, all owned by elderly residents or minority families. The scale of it turned my stomach. Rebecca's response was immediate. We're filing for federal warrants. Tonight. The next morning, the neighborhood woke to unmarked cars parked on corners and federal agents walking up Lorna's driveway. Her face, tight with fury, peeked from behind her curtains. She didn't open the door. Good, I muttered, watching from my porch. Let her sweat. But if Lorna thought she could still win this, she was about to learn the hard way that when you try to burn down a federal judge's home, you're not just playing with fire, you're writing your own sentencing memo. If Lorna thought federal agents on her lawn were the peak of her bad week, she was about to get an education. Because nothing screams endgame quite like your opponent watching you implode and taking notes for the prosecution. 3 nights after the fire marshal's inspection, my phone buzzed at 3:17 a.m. It was the security system's emergency alert. I wasn't at home. I'd been sleeping in Walt's guest room ever since we found those accelerants. But when I tapped the feed, the image made my blood run cold. 2 unmarked pickup trucks idled outside my property. 4 men in dark coveralls moved with the precision of people who'd done this before. They carried unmarked propane tanks, coils of hose, and duffel bags I could only assume weren't filled with camping gear. For the next 23 minutes, my cameras recorded everything. Accelerant poured in deliberate lines along the foundation. Gas connections rigged near electrical panels. Dry brush arranged like a fuse trail. It was surgical arson prep, designed to make the fire spread toward Lorna's property, the one insured for triple its actual value. And then, like a final spit in the face, Lorna herself showed up. Coral yoga set, perfect hair despite the hour, and a Channel 7 camera crew in tow. I received anonymous tips about fire hazards here, she told the reporter, standing directly over a line of fresh accelerant like she was posing for a crime scene reenactment. Community safety is my only concern. I nearly laughed the kind of laugh you get in court when a defendant walks right into your cross-examination trap. The next day, Morrison's lab results came back high-grade accelerant, fingerprints on the gas fittings, and soil patterns matching deliberate arson staging. It wasn't suspicious. It was premeditated. By evening, Rebecca had coordinated with the Colorado Attorney General's office, the FBI's Interstate Fraud Task Force, and the Treasury's Financial Crimes Unit. Federal warrants were issued for Lorna, her husband, and every member of her landscaping crew. Their bank accounts froze like a lake in January. Sterling Premium Builders, her husband's company, was placed under immediate asset forfeiture. But as satisfying as that was, the real show was still coming. At 4:12 a.m. the next morning, my phone buzzed again, this time with a call from Walt. His voice was tight. Judge, your house. It's gone. I was at the scene within minutes. From 3 blocks away, I could see the glow, not the flicker of a house fire, but the steady, roaring blaze of something lit to burn hot and fast. Firefighters were holding the line at the property edge, but the lodge Daniel and I had called home was collapsing in on itself, beams crumbling like matchsticks. Standing in Walt's bathrobe on his porch, I watched 27 years of memories curl into black smoke. Daniel's rose garden was nothing but glowing embers. The kitchen where we'd planned our retirement was a twisted skeleton of metal. His coffee mug, the one I couldn't bring myself to wash, was gone forever. It should have broken me. But when the investigators arrived, carrying out the fireproof housing from my security system, and played back the footage showing Lorna's husband on my property at 3:10 a.m., 47 minutes after she'd filed an insurance claim predicting damage from fire spread. I felt something colder than grief settle in. They'd given me exactly what I needed, irrefutable proof of premeditated arson and attempted murder of a federal judge. By sunrise, the neighborhood was awake and furious. Mrs. Rodriguez stood at the barricade, tears streaming down her face, shouting in Spanish about how Lorna had finally gone too far. People brought coffee, blankets, and, most importantly, their willingness to testify. Lorna made one last appearance that morning, strolling up to the fire line in designer sunglasses, her face arranged in mock sympathy for the cameras. This tragic accident, she said to Channel 7, proves why our HOA must enforce strict safety standards. Judge Mercer's resistance to inspections may have contributed to this loss. She didn't know the FBI had a microphone 6 feet away, recording every word for the murder trial. She didn't know the marshals were waiting for the signal to put her in cuffs before lunch. And she didn't know that in less than 24 hours, she'd be wearing an orange jumpsuit instead of coral yoga pants. Lorna thought she was still playing chess. She didn't realize she'd already been checkmated. In life, you don't get to choose every battle, but you do get to choose whether you stand and fight when the line is drawn. Losing my home, my peace, and nearly the last living piece of my husband taught me something I'll never forget. Silence only feeds the bully. Whether it's an HOA tyrant, a corrupt official, or someone closer to home, their power grows in the space where good people say nothing. Justice isn't just about punishment, it's about protection, healing, and making sure no one else suffers the same way. So, if you're facing your own fight, document everything, unite with your allies, and never underestimate the strength you carry. Your voice matters more than you think. Now I want to hear from you. What's the toughest fight you faced, and how did you push back? Share your story in the comments below so others know they're not alone. And if you believe in standing up for what's right, hit that like button, subscribe, and join me for more stories where justice wins and the bullies lose.